So recently, I shared this rendering I made of a roll of duct tape over on LinkedIn. It got quite a bit of comments, people asking for tutorials and such, which is great. And I don't mind making tutorials, but the problem with creating a tutorial on how to create a very realistic material is it's boring. It's just adding a lot of little nodes to add teeny little bits of detail here and there, and I'm just not sure anyone really wants to watch that. Now, what I have heard people say can be a challenge is the creative problem aspect of figuring out how to tackle making a new material in KeyShot from scratch. So I thought maybe I could try a different format here where I break down each material, take a look at its material graph, and try to talk about how I solved making each of those materials and the key decisions along the way I made that led to the materials being created. And I'll show you a few of the important nodes used along the way as well. So if you like this format, let me know. But if you don't like the format, definitely let me know so I don't make any more of them again. Without further ado, let's dive in. So whenever I need to make realistic looking materials in KeyShot, I start out with a good reference image. So I have that open on the left-hand side of my screen here. And I want to show you how I went from this very basic 3D model to something that looks like this using pretty much just the tools in KeyShot. I had to make one custom texture for this, but I'll get into that in a little bit. Let's go ahead and start off with working outside in. So we're gonna begin working on this silvery duct tape surface first. So let's take a look at the material graph, and I'm gonna break down how I went about recreating what I saw in the reference image step by step. And I think this is where a lot of people get stuck, is they just don't know where to begin and how to break this down into smaller steps. And that's kind of the goal of this video. It's not to show you literally how to create it yourself click by click, but it's rather how I went about breaking this problem down into manageable steps. So this is what the material graph looks like, and it may be a little overwhelming, but we're going to talk about each individual component in the order which I added them. So the first thing I noticed on the reference image are these horizontal stripes that have the strings in them. And you can see I have here two mesh textures. One's called horizontal. If I hit C on the keyboard to preview that, you can see what it actually looks like. So this is a mesh texture I got by going right click, texture, and mesh, and it's highly customizable because it's procedural. So I wanted to create these horizontal lines with a little bit of variation in them. So I went and began by mapping it to cylinder mode, and then I changed the actual shape of the pattern from polka dots or circles down to lines, which gives us what we see here. I then made sure I added some fall off, which kind of softens the edge of those lines. It makes them a lot softer. And then I adjusted the shape width as well as the pattern spacing to kind of match what I saw in the photo. And then finally, I added some distortion. So if I take the distortion down to nothing, you can see the lines are perfectly straight. Well, I had about 0.15, just a small amount of distortion to make it look a little less perfect. And that got us to this position right here. So before I went and made the vertical lines, I went ahead and made sure I unsynced this texture, and then I just duplicated it so that I didn't have to start from scratch again. Then the only change I really made for the vertical version is I rotated it 90 degrees under the angle settings, and I brought the lines a little closer together and scaled them down just a little bit, which you can see here. So that puts us into having these vertical and horizontal textures. And if you didn't know that you could name nodes in KeyShot, you can. It's just at the very top of the material properties, which is pretty cool. So those go together using a composite. That's how we combine them. And a color composite, you right click, you go to utilities and color composite, and that's what allows us to combine these textures. And here you can see I chose multiply to combine them. So if I preview this color composite, you see the two of these together. And you notice the vertical lines are way more subtle, like a light gray than the horizontal ones. That's because I use this source alpha slider. Think of this as a strength slider for each of these two textures, and the vertical one is plugged into source. So I brought this down to 0.25, which reduced its strength. Because in the picture, we can still see some vertical striations, just not very easily. So I wanted to bring those down a little bit. If I move to the right, that gets plugged into a displace node. And displacement is what is going, it's like a bump texture, but it just pushes these off the surface. And I had that set to a very small number. You can see 0.05 millimeters. It's an extremely small value. And I had to make the triangle size quite small to ensure I captured enough detail in there. Now, beyond the vertical and horizontal stripes, there are a few more things going on here. we have some bump textures. So if I disable these bump textures, you'll see what happens here. Actually, we'll do it over here. If I disable my bump, you can see that the duct tape is a little too smooth. If I zoom on out, it doesn't have quite the same character or grit that the photo does. So if I add in this bump texture, now that gives us that kind of grain that we need. And the way I achieve that is, one, I used a brushed radial. So if I preview that with C, it's we have to get really close to it to see. But it's just basically adding more uneven striations vertically. And then I've also combined that with two more. One is a noise fractal, which is this little thing. This gives it just a little bit of kind of that sort of organic, bumpy sort of looking texture there. And then we also have scratches. This is an interesting one. I added a bunch of scratches going pretty much in the same direction in order to add these kind of pits that you see in the photo there. And those all get combined using bump add nodes. You just daisy chain those as many as you need. And what's nice with the bump add is you can adjust how strong each of those textures are. So sometimes I increase or decrease the weights of those as needed. And the last thing really I did here is or almost the last thing, I adjusted, so I used this scratches and I plugged it into a color to number to control the specular value. All this does is it says wherever these little pits are, where the scratches are, make them less reflective. So this is kind of an advanced technique. It's a very, very minor effect, but I did choose to use it. And then finally, noise texture. If I zoom on in, this is just giving us some variable roughness. So the darker these little splotches are, the more reflective it is. And the lighter areas are a little bit more rough, so they don't appear as shiny, essentially. So when you combine all these and you get far away from the object, believe it or not, that captures pretty much all the detail you need to in order to recreate this sort of duct tape finish. So that's a brief overview of how I created probably the more complex material out of all these. This one takes the longest. It's kind of deceiving. It takes a while to rebuild this and get it to match the photo. Hey, I just wanted to jump in here and say I realize this may be a little bit confusing or advanced for you. And if that's the case, but you still really want to learn how to make realistic materials in KeyShot from scratch, then I definitely recommend checking out my KeyShot Material Masterclass. It's the most comprehensive course available on material creation in KeyShot, and I think you'd be really interested in it. So check it out. I'll link it down below, and we'll jump back into the tutorial now. So now when it comes to the side, this is probably going to be pretty surprising. It's fairly simple, but when I get into its material graph, you can see it's a little bit messy, but I'm only using one texture and a couple of utility nodes for this entire material. So if we go ahead and take a closer look, this one you want to get very close to in order to see what's happening. And I'll hide everything else so you can really see what's going on here. And when we look at the photo, this is kind of tricky, but you can see you've got these little kind of dashes, kind of marks of these dark blue that kind of, it's kind of like a blue, a gray, and a white. And what this reminded me of was the rings on a tree, because the radial, they're going around the spool in a circle, but they're a little uneven, and every so often they have these kind of darker blue pockets. And I figured that with KeyShot, we could use the Wood Advanced Procedural to kind of recreate that. So if I go ahead and preview that with C on the keyboard, you can see I've done my best with what I have here. It maybe could be improved a little bit. It's obviously not a one-to-one match, but the reason I used the Wood Advanced was mostly because you have all this control over this noise that you can introduce. And with all this noise and variation, you're able to get these little bumps here, these little irregular bumps. And as far as the color, I just sampled colors for each of the fall, winter, spring, and summer from the actual photo. I went with kind of like a dark, anywhere between a white and a dark bluish gray. And I made sure I had each kind of value represented here. And just by going through and zeroing out all these values and then starting to introduce them, I could understand what they were controlling. And I just played with them until I got these little clusters or bumps the way I wanted to. And I scaled the whole thing down very small so that when we actually zoom out and view the whole product the way it's going to be rendered, it actually ends up looking kind of like the photo. So if I go back to the camera here, this view, and I turn on the rest of the parts that I hid here, let's go ahead and do that. We can kind of see, you know, once we get all the way zoomed back out, I was able to essentially create a similar effect that we see on the side of the tape. Now, if the camera was going to get really close on the side of this, then this texture probably wouldn't hold up and I'd need a different approach. But in this case, I thought it worked pretty well. So the next part I tackled was the cardboard tube. So I'm gonna hide everything except for that so we can see it. And when we look at the photo, we don't get a ton of, we can't see a lot of what's happening in there. We certainly can see a bit of the color. We can tell it's kind of grainy. That's pretty much it. So the first thing I actually started out with was this brushed radial texture. So if I preview this, this is really at the heart of it. I started with this texture. It's a little bit tough to see here. I've made it very small. You know, I've used some of these sliders to make it, you know, kind of irregular and add some noise and things like that. And it's really a basic texture, but I have it plugged into displace and it's displacing the surface. So if I hit the geometry node button again, you should be able to see it's kind of pushing things around here. And that's just to give it some more of that little detail there. It kind of looks like my surface just broke apart, did it? That's just an artifact on the edge, given how fine those details are. If I really needed to, I could probably increase the number of triangles here. That might help. Once I had this in place, I moved to the color. So I still have a plastic material for this because I want a little bit of shininess, but it's mostly a rough material. And in order to add the color, I have a couple of textures being combined. So first off, if we look at my spots texture on the far left, if I were to preview this, we can see we've got a mostly kind of a brown with slightly darker brown spots. And all I did was start with the same color for both of these and made one slightly darker than the other. And with the spots texture, you again have lots of control over the shape of it. So I played around with things to play with the distortion and the number of levels and just kept pushing it until it had this kind of splotchy effect. And then I increased the fall off quite a bit to make it very soft on the edges. And then I used a color adjust, it looks like here, because sometimes when you use these colors, these textures that have multiple color fields, it's easier to adjust the color with one single node where you just have a slider for things like hue and saturation and value and stuff like that. So that's what that's doing. And then I have a noise texture going in here, which is, you know, use a lot of these noise textures to add a bit more grit or grain, if you will. And that's being plugged into the background of the color composite. And when we set those to multiply, you can see it creates this kind of cardboard-like material. And that's just being plugged into the color of the plastic. I also have a color to number that's controlling the specular. So this is, you know, probably not entirely, that was a little too high. Probably not entirely necessary, but again, specular controls like how reflective more or less a surface is. And by having variation in this, it makes it a little more realistic. So the areas that are lighter are reflecting a little more light than the areas that are darker here. And that's really it for this one. It's pretty simple. It's a part that doesn't get seen very much, so I didn't really spend that much time on it compared to some of the others. Then the last one that I want to show you is the inside of the cardboard tube, which employs a couple of cool tricks. So if I turn that on here, so if we take a look at the material graph for the inside of the cardboard tube, we've got a couple things going on. There are actually two layers. One of them is a label. So I'm going to start by disabling that label so you can see what we started out with. And I'll move some of these nodes out of the way here, make this a little more easy. So for this first layer, we have this plastic going into the surface. It's just a white plastic. And then we have this diagonal cut in it. The way I did that was just to take a mesh like we did before. If I preview that, it's just a line that's at an angle. And I made it the same way as I did with the lines that we saw on the outside of the silver part of the tape. I just took that mesh, I set its mapping type to cylinder, and I changed the shape to a line, and I played with the size and scaling down here. And I made the pattern spacing really big, so I only had one visible instance. And then I just rotated it at an angle until it looked good to me. I used that as an opacity map in order to basically make this layer of white paper disappear on the inside of the tube. So this is just plugged into opacity. But the reason we have a color composite here as well is because I'm using another opacity map. This is a texture map that I had to create in Photoshop. Unfortunately, it's sort of possible to do this in KeyShot, but it becomes very tedious and I didn't want to do it that way. You could either do this by hand using the 3D paint in KeyShot or masking and compositing some textures. To me, it was easier to open Photoshop and just draw a bit of a jagged line like this using a paintbrush, like nothing special. And I copied and pasted that line so I have it on top and bottom. So if I scale this down a little bit, let's just scale this texture down. You can see what it looks like. It's just two lines that are jagged on the edge. I just scaled those up so that they kind of cover the edge. And the whole reason for this is gonna give me kind of a jagged edge because when I modeled this inside piece of paper just a little bit bigger than the surface behind it, the cardboard tube. And so when I plug this into the opacity, if we get out of that preview, I can hide this cardboard tube. So here's our piece of paper, and I'm using this mesh and this texture map here that I painted in Photoshop to cut this out like a stencil. You can see how the edges are a little jagged, and then there's that sharp line there. That's what these two are being used for. And in the color composite, you can see in black and white exactly what they look like. I just multiplied those together the same way we combined the two meshes on the outside of the tape, and we've just plugged that into opacity, and wherever the black is, that material that it's plugged into will disappear, and the white will be what's left. I used this noise fractal to give a slight papery, very subtle texture into the bump of this plastic, just to give it a slight texture. I also textured the specular value using the same fractal texture. Again, it's super duper subtle, but it just means that when light kind of hits this at a glancing angle, it won't reflect perfectly uniformly. It'll have some kind of splotches to it. And then the last step was to create my logo on there. So if I hit enable, a lot of these tapes have repeating logos on the inside. Well, how do you do that? I had my WG logo, but how do I get it to go in this pattern all the way around? That's a trick that can be done using another mesh. These little mesh procedurals are probably more useful than most people realize inside KeyShot. So what you do is you create your mesh, and actually I'll show you right now. If I grab one of these mesh textures and I hit C to preview and I go to cylinder mapping, you can see these dots. I can go down to the shape and change it to hexagonal so it kind of offsets them. And I can increase the spacing a little bit so they're a little bit further apart. As far as this seam, it's kind of annoying. You would just need to go and move the texture and basically rotate that so it's kind of hidden from the view that we're gonna be looking at. And then wherever these dots are, my logo will appear if I plug this texture, this mesh, into the texture. So you can plug this in here. You have to have your texture map set to node instead of the normal mapping type. And by doing that, wherever those circles were, my texture or logo will appear. And this is a white logo, but all I had to do was hit blend with color, and I could choose a color down here. So that's what's nice. If you're working with a white texture, you can kind of change its color to whatever you want. If you do this, if you try to use this mesh to do the mapping of your texture, make sure you have a texture that's got some transparency. So I've got a white WG with transparency around it, and I saved it out as a PNG. If you don't do that, then you're not gonna have a clean stencil like this. So lastly, these are plugged into a plastic, and that's added as a label on top of the paper. So almost think of it like printing ink on top of paper. That's like your label in this case. And those make this final material. So if I close that and I bring back all the parts that we were looking at before and look at everything all together, this is what it ends up looking like. And that's really all that went into this. And there you go. So hopefully you learned how I make decisions along the way, especially when it comes to building new materials from scratch. And I hope you learned something. Now I will be getting back to some more traditional step-by-step KeyShot content very soon. So if you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed. And until next time, Happy rendering.